Retired pastor Bob Russell tells the following account to illustrate how Christians today oftentimes go along with the moral pace of those around us, and that by comparison we feel safe because, after all, people think everybody's doing it and therefore it must be okay. Bob Russell writes, 2 months ago my wife and I were visiting our son Rusty and his family, and one day Rusty was test driving a foreign-made car and was frustrated because he couldn't figure out how to change the speedometer reading from kilometers to miles. That evening he suggested that we take the kids out for ice cream. We'll need to take 2 cars, he insisted, so you and Mom just follow me. I followed him and was surprised when a policeman whizzed up behind us with his lights flashing. I couldn't imagine he was after me because I didn't feel like I was speeding. They've never heard that before, I'm sure. And besides, he said, I was going the exact same speed as the guy in front of me. The officer came up to my window and said, "Sir, you were going 58 miles per hour in a 45 mile per hour zone, but wait right here. I'm going to deal with the car in front of you, and I'll be right back." When he went to my son's car, Rusty said, "Officer, I know this is going to sound like a line, but this is the first day I've driven this car, and I can't figure out how to change it from kilometers to miles per hour, so I had no idea how fast I was going. The guy behind me is my dad, and he doesn't know what he's doing either." The takeaway, sort of, if you're going to follow, you need to make sure the guy you're following knows what he's doing. Who to follow? Life is filled with choices, isn't it? College, work, trade school, new car, used car, ranch, split level, the Christian faith, or some other faith. Now, some choices make a big difference. Others might not be such a big deal. While we were on vacation, I was faced with an extremely important choice every morning. Banana smoothie or strawberry smoothie? I chose both. While that may work in the world of refreshments, in life, in the important things, it really doesn't work. There are times, in fact, we have to make a choice. We can't have it both ways, and sometimes our choice will make literally all the difference in the world. So this morning we're going to come face to face with some choices that Jesus offers. Consider the choices, Matthew chapter 6, and we'll begin reading with verse 19. Matthew 6, verse 19. I invite you to stand for the reading of God's Word. In the midst of this Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is teaching, and he says as follows: "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Say that with me. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Thank you so much. You may be seated. You recognize we are studying through the Gospel of Matthew, and we get to this point, and Jesus is going to encourage us to consider some choices. He wants us to understand, I believe, the correlation between treasure and trust. The correlation between treasure and trust. There are 2 central commands that Jesus will offer, and they will be followed by some correctives. So overall, there are 3 things that I want us to glean from the text this morning. First of all, I want us to recognize what not to do, what not to do. Verse 19, do not, Jesus says, lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. Do not lay up treasures on earth. Now, what exactly are these treasures on earth about which Jesus is speaking? These are, in fact, things money can buy. Nothing wrong with having nice things. Don't anybody misunderstand me. There's nothing wrong with having nice things. The key to all of this, I believe, in fact, is balance. And we have to be careful, extremely careful, that we do not become judgmental toward those who have more than we do. And we have to make sure that we don't become judgmental toward those who have less than we do. Some people have more things and more money because they've worked harder. Sometimes they've been more fortunate. They've been blessed by God to make a lot of money. And we who may not be in that same category ought to sit back and celebrate the favor and blessings of God along with them. If they've earned it honestly, then more power to them. They may have a lot of things, and they may also, and don't miss this, they may also be among some of the most generous people in the world. So celebrate when God blesses our brothers and sisters with financial gain. Some people on the other side of this may not have a lot. That may be because they've just not been able to make a lot of money, or it might very well be because they have chosen by design to live a simpler life. One of the wealthiest guys that I knew, who was a part of another church that I once served, drove around in a 25-year-old pickup truck and wore overalls like Sam Walton. People didn't know the man owned half the community, but that's just the way that he was. He lived a simple life. The point is, be very careful about judgment on such things. The point is not to let the things of the world, not to let treasures on earth consume us. We all are aware and know people who have spent their lives literally chasing a buck. They would walk on whomever, they would do whatever, they would sell out to whatever for the opportunity to make their next dollar. We've also known people who literally could not care any less about material possessions at all. And you probably, like I have, you've known people who felt it was their lot in life to keep track of everybody else's spending. The first church I pastored, I followed a senior pastor who drove a Cadillac. It was a nice car. I don't know how much he paid. That wasn't any of my business. I don't care how much he paid. It was a used car. The only reason I knew that is because he told me, and it was in nice shape. He was in his mid-50s. He had been working since he was 15 years old. His wife worked full-time too. Should the pastor of that church driving a Cadillac have been a big deal? Well, it wasn't a big deal to me, but some people thought that his used Cadillac was the equivalent of Creflo Dollar's $65 million jet. We had people in the same church who were driving Lincolns and Mercedes-Benz and Cadillacs and everything else, and some of those guys drove pickup trucks, and we all know that a new pickup truck fully loaded is always going to be more than the Cadillac. Anyway, I'm not going to go there. But people became so preoccupied with the man's car. And then they started literally counting how many times he went out to lunch during the week and how many times he went to dinner. They thought it was their responsibility to track his personal spending. So he retires, and then I'm called as the senior pastor at the ripe old age of 29. And I was driving at that time. This is going to be one of those uphill in the snow both ways stories, so stay with me. I was driving from St. Louis to Kansas City to go to seminary. And during several semesters, I would leave our house just outside of St. Louis at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then I would drive to Kansas City. I would have class. I would leave after class was finished at 12:30. That's after a stop at the Waffle House really early. I would drive back to St. Louis for an evening class. So you can figure out pretty quickly I was racking up a lot of miles on our car. So I bought a small economy car. It was the coolest 5-speed manual transmission station wagon you've ever seen. And I thought to myself, being young and dumb, nobody can say anything about this. And then somebody asked, what's the matter? Can't he afford to drive a better car? Our last pastor drove a Cadillac. The point, you can't win is the point. So Jesus is talking about things that money can buy. He doesn't mention things that come immediately to our minds: big house, expensive car, jewelry, bracelets. Bracelets. That's right, bracelets. He's not talking about the big stuff. In fact, he's talking about not just wants, but he's talking about needs. He mentions food. We all need that. He talks about things to drink and clothing, things that we need. So treasures on earth can actually be things that we need. The issue is bigger than whether or not you can live in luxury. The question is, do you trust money more than the God who provides? Is money the main man or the middle man? This is not an indictment against being a good steward. Jesus is not, and hear me clearly, Jesus is not anti-investment. He's not degrading having a savings account or making some plan for retirement or having some money put back for an emergency. Jesus is asking, how do we see things? How do things matter? And he's going to get to that, and look with me at this in verse 22. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? He's asking, how do we see things? How is your eye? Is it healthy? Do you look at things from the right perspective? How do you view the things you have? Are you healthy in that regard, or do you live in the dark? So laying up for yourselves treasures on earth is the selfish route that indicates one's belief that money and possessions, rather than God, would be what's most important. It's human nature to look for greener pastures, to wish for better circumstances, more affluence, or an easier life. We think oftentimes, if only I had a better job or a nicer house or a better car, then I would be happy. And to a lot of people, that seems very logical. According to this logic, however, people in the United States should be among the happiest people on earth. We enjoy greater wealth per capita than most countries. We have more opportunity for education, medical care, home ownership, car ownership, food availability, freedoms, and the list goes on and on and on. But a 2012 Gallup poll ranked the United States 33rd in the world on a happiness scale. Having more does not increase our happiness. In fact, 7 of the top 10 countries were in Latin America, which generally ranks low on the typical economic indicators we might associate with happiness. Civil war-torn Guatemala, which ranks just above Iraq in the United Nations Human Development Index, is 7th highest in the world in terms of positive emotions. Despite escalating gang violence that produces one of the world's highest homicide rates and cripples their economy, Guatemalans are happier than Americans. A similar story is reflected in Panama. Residents of Panama, which ranks 90th in the world with respect to GDP per capita, are among the most likely to report positive emotions. Residents of Singapore, which ranks 5th in the world in terms of GDP per capita, are the least likely to report positive emotions. So what does all this translate to? It means more money doesn't equal happiness. And we cannot serve two masters. So what not to do? Secondly, I want you to recognize not only what not to do, but I want you to see what to do. Verse 20, but, Jesus says, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. Lay up treasures in heaven. Instead of seeing money as a source of provision, you recognize that God is the source of provision and He blesses you with whatever it is you've been blessed with. Instead of getting things because you're fretting about not having everything you want or need, what ought we to do? We ought to utilize whatever we have to the glory of God as well as to the benefit of others. You make sure that whatever you have, you hold to very lightly. It all belongs to God in the first place and in the last place anyway, and don't ever allow money to become your God. As someone said, it's like you have to have a conversation with your material possessions, and you sit down and you say, thanks for coming by today. I wanted to get some things straightened out. Listen, I just want to make sure you understand the rules. I don't serve you. You serve me. Got it? So, is there something wrong with Christians having nice things, expensive things? No. Again, balance is the key, and everybody's going to be different. What's expensive for one person may not be quite as expensive for somebody else. We're blessed. Many of us are thinking about retiring someday. Some of you probably think about retiring more days than others. But do you realize, just to put this in perspective, do you realize the very small percentage of people in human history that have ever been granted the luxury of even considering retirement? And many of us have that luxury. We are blessed. And in that sense, we are blessed beyond measure. The key to balance is making sure that you have your money and your things, as you have heard, and that your money and your things don't have you. You can be fully committed to Christ and have all kinds of money. You can be very poor and be fully committed to Christ. That's not the issue. Jesus makes it clear, however, that we cannot serve both God and money. Now, listen carefully. Contrary to what some people are going to tell you, Jesus knew exactly what he was talking about. And you know, if you've ever begun to sell your soul toward that which is material, you know deep down in your heart of hearts that we cannot serve both God and money. In fact, if you falter in this area, there are other fault lines that will soon become apparent in your character. In an interview with Rolling Stone magazine, the great theologian Brad Pitt reflected on his lead role in a movie called Fight Club many years ago. And it's about a man who was living the American dream, and yet he remained unsatisfied. Listen to what Brad Pitt says. I can't believe I actually said that. Listen to what Brad Pitt said. And don't tell anybody that I used anything Brad Pitt said in a sermon, because I'm orthodox. Here we go. Pitt said, I know all these things are supposed to seem important to us, the car, the condo, our version of success. But if that's the case, why is the general feeling out there reflecting more impotence and isolation and desperation and loneliness? If you ask me, I say toss all this. We got to find something else. Because all I know is that at this point in time, we are heading for a dead end, a numbing of the soul, a complete atrophy of the spiritual being, and I don't want that. Rolling Stone magazine then asked the question, so if we're heading toward this kind of existential dead end in society, what do you think should happen? Pitt says, hey man, I don't have those answers yet. The emphasis now is on success and personal gain. I'm sitting in it, and I'm telling you that's not it. I'm the guy who's got everything, I know, but I'm telling you, once you've got everything, then you're just left with yourself. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, it doesn't help you sleep any better, and you don't wake up any better because of it. It's kind of funny, because Jesus said something even much more profound some 2,000 years ago. You cannot serve God and money. Now, does this mean that God doesn't want you to have money? No. If somebody said you cannot serve God and money, but you can serve God with money, I'm grateful for all Christians who give generously to Christian causes and who give to the church regardless of their income. And we ought to all be grateful for those believers whom God allows to make all kinds of money, and in turn they're generous with that. You know our country these days is divided about all of this. And I've told you that I think, my humble but accurate opinion, the extremes in both parties get this wrong. Somewhere between the give everybody everything that they want crowd and the don't give anybody anything that they need crowd probably lies the answer. Jesus, you know, spoke often of the poor. The Bible also speaks of taking responsibility. It makes it clear that a man who is able ought to be able to work to provide for his family. The Bible makes that very clear. The truth is, much of our economic problems are less economic problems and more heart problems. It's the responsibility of a person to earn a living if they're able. And when somebody hits hard times, then of course he or she should be helped when possible. And I know, hear me very clearly, I know there are times that it is not possible, but they should also be working to get back on their feet. If you look at a family and they're fourth generation welfare recipients and dependents on that, there are systemic issues that need to be addressed. Here's the heart problem explained now that I've made everybody angry. Nobody should expect everybody else to take care of them. Neither should those with means expect to never be willing to help somebody who has a legitimate need. Both scenarios to the extreme are wrong. Just because Jesus said we would always have the poor with us does not negate the responsibility we have to help the poor and ultimately to help the poor help themselves to a better standard of living. Is there greed in America? You bet. Does capitalism sometimes fuel greed? Now listen carefully. Does capitalism sometimes fuel greed? You bet. Does socialism sometimes fuel greed? You bet. Here's the thing. Listen to me carefully, lest I be misunderstood. Being human fuels greed. You remember the story of the rich young ruler? He was so blind to his sin of adoring his possessions. And what did Jesus say? He said, you go sell everything you've got, give money to the poor, and then, son, you're going to have treasure in heaven. Now, I don't understand all that Jesus meant with that, and I don't think anybody else does either. But at least part of the point was that if you want to be rich toward God, you have to be rich toward others. Sometimes we get the lessons and sometimes we don't. And if you've raised kids, you know sometimes your kids get the lessons and sometimes they don't. John Ortberg shares the following about trying to teach his children about stewardship. He said, when our kids were little, we put them on the envelope system. When we would give them an allowance, they would put it in envelopes labeled give, save, gifts, spend, and so on. He said, I thought it was working until one day I had a Band-Aid on my arm, and my daughter, who was at the time about 6, asked, why? And I explained I had gotten a medical exam that day to get life insurance. And she said, what's that? And I explained to her, well, Daddy loves you so much and loves our family so much, so that if anything were to happen to Daddy, which of course it won't, but if it would provide $250,000. And her eyes got really wide, and he braced himself for her tears. She has a tender heart, he said, and I knew she'd be worried. And then she looked up at me and said, $250,000 a piece? And he said, I thought, I'm not sure the right lesson is being communicated. So what not to do, what to do. Thirdly and finally, and then we're out of here, what to understand. Verse 24, no one can serve two masters. Say that with me. No one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. Say this with me. You cannot serve God and money. A divided heart makes for divided loyalties, which makes for an unstable life. No matter what anybody else in the world of politics or religion or economics will tell you, hear me clearly, Jesus got it right. You and I cannot serve God and money, period. That's true, by the way, about money and a lot of other things too. In other words, if you try to serve anything to the degree, if you try to love anything to the degree, if you try to do anything with the same commitment that your commitment to God is, that thing becomes an idol and will cause great grief in your life. Whatever we might give prominence to in our lives has the potential to cause us to live with divided loyalty. So here's the question. Is there anything in your life at this very moment that you cherish as much as God? If there is, then at some level that thing, or maybe that person, is an idol. And Jesus said, you can't serve God and essentially anything else. When I was a boy, my father, a baker, introduced me to the wonders of song, wrote tenor Luciano Pavarotti. He said he urged me to work very hard to develop my voice. Arrigo Pola, a professional tenor in my hometown, took me on as a pupil. I also enrolled in a teacher's college, and on graduating, I asked my father, shall I be a teacher or a singer? Luciano, my father replied, if you try to sit on two chairs, you will fall between them. For life, you must choose one chair. I chose one. It took 7 years of study and frustration before I made my first professional appearance. It took another 7 to reach the Metropolitan Opera, and now I think whether it's laying bricks, writing a book, whatever we choose, we should give ourselves to it. Commitment, that's the key. Choose one chair. So that begs the question, which chair are you choosing?